Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the Battle of Coral Sea. It's been a little bit of a while since I've done a video, and I was watching this History Undone uh, discussion about Coral Sea, and there were some things that, as I watched, I realized two things. First of all, that people don't always give Coral Sea its full value, if you will. It has its narrative, right? It was the first sea battle between carriers where the surface combatants never saw each other, for example. And the resultant battle has its own narrative of being a tactical Japanese victory, but a strategic American victory. And beyond that, with just a little bit of foreshadowing of the Midway battle, with in particular with respect to the Yorktown being damaged and being put back into service very quickly. That's mostly what we think of, or at least most people that I talk to about historical stuff when we talk about battles and things like that. And they don't really know Coral Sea. And the reality is, this is one of those battles that actually does serve as a genuine critical turning point that goes unnoticed. And the reason it goes unnoticed is because, in this case, Midway follows it up a few weeks later and just overshadows it. So today we're going to look at um, the ideas that the History Undone folks debated. And for those of you who haven't seen their channel, what they do is they take the first half of the show and they lay out the actual history as it occurred of a given event, and then they inject their ideas about the future. So we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to take a slightly different tact. Now, I'm going to take my mug off the screen. You don't need to see me anymore here. I just wanted you to know that I'm a real human being and not artificial intelligence. And so let's go ahead and get started. So for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to look at the battle. So we're going to try and keep our historical changes as simple as possible. As I said already, this is that first carrier-based operation where the fleets never come into gun range, right? They fight, and it determines whether Japan can proceed to Port Moresby or not. For those of you not familiar with it, we're going to do a really high-level overview of the battle. There's more details in the History Undone and other videos that go into the day by day, step by step. But generally speaking, what you have here is a force coming from the north through the gap here that's intended to come around to Port Moresby and do an invasion there and secure the peninsula here of New Guinea for future operations. And this transport set of transports has a group of has a light carrier called Shoho, which is providing limited air support for that operation. The Japanese also have two fleet carriers, the Jukaku and the Shokaku, that are coming around the Solomons looking for the American aircraft carriers, which are known to be generally in the area. And down here you have Task Force 17, which consists of the Lexington and the Yorktown. And without getting into all the gory details, the American operation here initially is sort of segregated, and they eventually consolidate and work as a team. So that's going to be our starting point. And for the purpose of this, we're going to try this video. We're going to try and talk about the question that the guys on History Undone pose. Is there a way that Coral Sea ends up being a major Japanese victory, or if you want to look at it the reverse, a major American defeat? We're going to show how that can be possible, and depending on how it happens, it can result in either no change to the course of history or very dramatic changes. Once we've set the conditions for the victory, we'll take a look, obviously, at the operation itself. And then we're going to follow on to the most immediate Battle of Midway, which was affected by Coral Sea, and then the larger Pacific War, the consequences. And in the end, we're going to also try and answer the simple question, you know, does this do anything to help Japan win the war? And as a little foreshadowing, no, it doesn't. So for those of you not familiar with it, I'm going to go through real quickly at a high level. We're not going to get into all the gory details. Bottom line is that the battle runs from about the 4th of May through the 8th of 1942, with most of the activities occurring on the 4th and then again on the 7th and 8th. The 5th and 6th are kind of just a lot of moving around, but not a lot of meaningful action. So what happens on the 4th is Tulagi is this seaplane base right here, and sort of this is one of the opening stages. Fletcher detaches the Yorktown to go up and make a strike on the air base here, which conducts reconnaissance out in the Solomon Island area and to the east. And they basically, over a series of multiple attacks during the day, they do some damage, fair amount of damage, and then they recover the aircraft, head south, and eventually, over the next 2 days, on the 5th and 6th, the U.S. basically reassembles Task Force 17 and gets ready for operations against the Japanese. They're, both sides are conducting aerial reconnaissance and things like that during these days, but not a whole lot is um, happening in terms of battle progression. Then on the 7th of May, the Japanese attack the Neosho, and they misidentify it as a carrier. And this is a ship that's kind of down here in the southern regions. At the time, the American carriers were further to the northwest there, and they get onto this ship and they look at this thing and they say this is a carrier. Like, okay, well, whatever. They attack it and they sink. They sink the attendant destroyer, the USS Sims, and they damage this. And they believe that they have successfully sunk an aircraft carrier. How they come to that conclusion, I don't know, but they did. Okay, the next day, I think might have the date wrong on this, but I'm not super concerned with the details, to be honest. Leading up to it, the United States the Americans attacked the Shoho. I thought that was on the 8th, but it might have been on the 7th. The point is that the Americans are kind of focused more up on the landing force, which is being escorted by the Shoho, and they go out and they identify the Shoho as being one of the fleet carriers, and they attack it and they sink it. And it's like, well, that's great, but the simple reality is it's not a major aircraft carrier. Carries, half or slightly under half of what one of the fleet carriers can handle. It's basically more like one of the American escort carriers later in the war. The evening of the 7th, the Japanese do try and make an attack on the United States fleet, but it more or less goes to nowhere. And there is some air action that degrades the Jukaku's air strength, air wing some, but it's a fairly inconclusive activity on the evening of the 7th. The main thing about this is some of the more senior Japanese aviators were lost in this evening activity, and so when they do fight the next day, um, you know, the the most experienced Japanese aviators have been slightly depleted. And here's the big day. The Americans strike the Shokaku and Jukaku. Shokaku is damaged, and that's going to be sufficiently severe that when she returns to Japan, she'll be in repairs for quite some time and will not be available. The Jukaku is not physically damaged, but her air wing is degraded. And so, more or less, what you have is a partial Japanese operation here at this stage. Meanwhile, their airplanes have been out doing the favor back to the Americans, and everyone's probably seen this photo of the Lexington listing right before she's goes under in his scuttle. And the Yorktown receives I think it's a 250 kilogram bomb right through the flight deck and is severely damaged. So, starting on the 4th all the way up till the morning of the 8th, um, one of the things that we're going to do in this discussion is we're going to leave all of that intact. We're not going to change the Battle of the Coral Sea, and we're going to make decisions. We're going to look at the decisions right around the time when Lexington is being put under, with scuttling activities and the actions of what Fletcher is going to do with the Yorktown. So here's where we're going to pick up uh, as far as my discussion and my scenarios are and how they differ from what the guys on History Undone talked about. Um, I love the show. One of the things they start off with is, we ask if a split second decision could have changed the outcome, and then of course from there they speculate about what the consequences of that would be. And that occurs about, for those of you interested, that occurs about 35 minutes into the video. So if you want to go and watch that, the first half of that first 35 minutes is a much more detailed description of the events leading up to the morning of the 8th, the point at which the Yorktown is damaged and the Lexington is being prepared for scuttle. And so at this point, the monitor turns to Drac and asks him, well, so what are some of the things that could have changed this from being a strategic draw, if you will, American win and a Japanese tactical win, but an American strategic win? What could have changed it? And here's where you start to think about when you do revisionist history, how much are you going to change to make the scenario fit the way you want it to? And I always like to take the approach that we're going to do the least possible change to the historical record in the favor of one of the most likely and foreseeable choices that the people would have made at that time with the information they had. In other words, we're not going to look back and with hindsight and say, "Oh, they should have done this or they should have done that." And Drac doesn't really do that, but he does do something a little different. Notice he says, "Well, there's a couple things that could have happened. First of all, the scouting for the Neosho might have found the carriers, in which case the initial Japanese air attacks would have been directed against the American carriers before the American carriers even knew where the Japanese carriers were. And the consequence could have resulted in one or more of the American fleet carriers being destroyed and little or no damage to the attackers." Um, he talks about how the late evening strike on the 7th might have found the carriers and struck them then. Once again, potentially engaging the Americans first, potentially degrading them, one or two carriers, and potentially leaving the entire Japanese strike force intact. And as sort of as a confirmation of how he envisioned this battle to unfold, he talks about whether Nimitz would later gamble two ships, two carriers against six later on in the Battle of Midway. So the consequence of these changes is to basically a wholesale restructuring of the battle. And it's no longer the Battle of the Coral Sea as we know it. It's the Massacre of the Coral Sea or whatever, right? It's a totally different battle with totally different strategic implications. And, obviously, if the Japanese have six fleet carriers at Midway, things look different than if they have four. So these are that's not the way I want to approach my scenarios here. I want to look at this as, hey, what was happening and what decision can we point to that would have changed the result of the battle and given Japan their major victory, but not necessarily totally, completely restructured the battle. So, with that said, let's take a look at the two scenarios that I want to address today. And I'm really interested in what other people have to say. If you got any comments, please, throw them in there. Love to have these kinds of discussions. But what I'm going to do is basically start with scenario one here, where Fletcher retires more or less immediately after the Lexington is sunk. I don't have the exact timeline, but the Yorktown does depart fairly quickly, but the Japanese don't understand that the departure has taken place, and so they're not confident of their situation, and they have one carrier damaged and one degraded, and so they end up calling off the operation. So in our scenario, everything about the battle is literally unchanged. Every bullet that was fired, every airplane that was shot down, every bomb that was dropped, every torpedo that was launched is unchanged up until, let's say, noon on the 8th. 11 a.m. was sort of the engagement with the Lexington and the Yorktown being damaged. And so let's say at noon, Fletcher recognizes, I got to get out of here, and he beats feet. Sort of the analogy I would use is look forward a few weeks to when Wade McCluskey is running out of gas at Midway, and he has to decide whether to head for Midway, turn around and head back to the carriers, or oh, by the way, there's this destroyer down here, this Japanese going in the wrong direction, and he turns and he follows that destroyer, and of course ends up going up on top. Well, imagine if Yorktown had turned and hightailed it out of the area, and Japanese reconnaissance saw them heading off to the east instead of heading north or northwest or west. The whole interpretation of what was going on in the Coral Sea might have changed. So the decision to leave immediately, followed by the Japanese commander's decision to, verify that he had air superiority and proceed. Those are the decisions. So we haven't changed a single bullet, a single aspect of the battle. It's just a decision is made by one commander, Fletcher, and the adversarial commander is able to, in his own mind, reconcile the information that they now have superiority, air superiority. So that's scenario number one. Um, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about later. And the key on this scenario one will be that the Yorktown remains available just like it did. It'll go back to Pearl Harbor 3 days later. They'll patch it up and they'll send it off to Midway. The second scenario basically starts at this same point, about noon on the 8th, and Fletcher decides to leave. Well, we're going to make it a little more definitive here. Yorktown is either sunk so that the Japanese know definitively that Lexington and Yorktown are sunk, or it's otherwise unavailable for Midway. And the next decision is not here at the Battle of Coral Sea, but is actually later on as to whether or not to fight the Battle of Midway without Yorktown. But the key in the second scenario will be don't Yorktown is not available for one reason or another. So let's look at scenario one. As I've said before, the battle itself, all the way from the 4th until the morning of the 8th, is exactly as it occurred in reality. So we don't have to revise history or alter history to set the conditions for our discussion of the future. So let's talk about what happens around noon on the 8th of May. I'm going to make the suggestion that for this scenario that the Yorktown departs immediately. Once they know that the Lexington can't be salvaged, they put best speed to the east and they put a small detachment of ships around them. And the takeaway, the assumption built into this is that the Japanese detect this and they recognize it for what it is, that the Americans are withdrawing, and consequently they, even in their degraded condition with a Jukaku's air arm being degraded, that they maintain local air superiority. And what this does psychologically is that gives them time to think about, can we still go ahead with Port Moresby or not? And in this scenario, they'll spend the next day or so consolidating their forces. Remember, the Shoho was sunk up in this area right here, right? And the fleet carriers are over here. The Shokaku and the Jukaku are over here. Okay, so they're going to consolidate the transports and the fleet carriers. Jukaku still has more aircraft than the Shoho ever had, so they still have the ability to provide basic combat air patrol and to provide air support in the attack. And so they make the decision that they're going to go ahead with that operation. And because there's no naval forces to speak of, there is an Australian cruiser group here, which might have to be dealt with. But we're going to assume that for the purposes, basically the Allies have departed the battlefield, at least when it comes to air power. And so they proceed with Port Moresby, and yeah, maybe a day or two of delay to get reorganized and continue, but more or less they execute the plan as they intended. Now, is there any guarantee that they would have won this battle? No. Wake Island, they got repulsed. The Battle of Philippines is dragging on much longer than they expected. But for the sake of this discussion, we're going to assume that the more or less 6 months of unbroken amphibious successes will be continued here on the assumption they're not interfered with by the American carriers. So in our scenario, operation for Port Moresby succeeds. They bring in ground-based aircraft and establish an airhead there, and within some reasonable number of days, Yukaku and Shokaku are returned. The reality is Shokaku probably returns uh, early, and Jukaku comes in a couple of days behind schedule. And once they arrive there, we're going to be more or less making the assumption that the Japanese handle those two ships the same way that they did in reality. Uh, Shokaku is going to go into repairs, and Jukaku is not going to be, miraculously refitted with a new air group and added to become the fifth carrier at Midway. Psychologically, we don't think that the Japanese are going to change their philosophy in the home islands about how to handle these two ships simply because they secured Port Moresby. So, with one single change, an immediate departure by Fletcher, followed by a recognition of that departure on the part of the Japanese, both of which are simply decisions of the mind, if you will. The Port Moresby operation, we're going to assume, continues on. And in the process, this gives Japan the major victory or the major American defeat that the History Undone team was asking for. Anyone who would look at a scenario in which the Lexington was sunk and the Yorktown was driven off the battlefield and Port Moresby was captured, and not say that the Japanese had a major strategic and tactical victory, that's just not realistic. That would have been a huge, huge victory. Okay, and obviously they're going to downplay the damage that they suffered to themselves, and so this is going to be a major uh, victory for them, any way you slice it. Now, what does it mean for the rest of the war, right? Midway and beyond. For the purpose of my discussion, I'm going to assume that more or less Midway proceeds according to plan, right? Shokaku and Jukaku go back to Japan and go through the refits that they did in actual reality. The Yorktown returns to Pearl Harbor and gets the 3-day makeover and is pushed out, and that the three American carriers conduct themselves exactly the same at Midway as they did in real life. Okay, and if that's the case, here we see a scenario where a major Japanese victory at Coral Sea has no substantial impact on the war. Midway goes off as planned. Um, there's no doubt that by having Port Moresby, the Solomon campaign will be more difficult. Guadalcanal becomes probably a little more tenable from the Japanese point of view. Is it possible that the New Guinea campaign is completely abandoned? it's possible, but probably it's delayed, and the first step is to go back and take Port Moresby instead of starting from Port Moresby. So, but the bottom line is the long term results don't change, because at the end of the Battle of Midway, in this scenario, we have four fleet carriers sunk, one damaged, and one with a degraded air wings sitting in Japan because they're not creative enough to put different airplanes on it, right? So, and then of course, probably the most significant impact will be uh, the invasion, or the fight at Guadalcanal will probably be more demanding, more difficult, but not necessarily any different. In the long run, the mass of American power just crushes them. So I don't think here we have a scenario where it's a major Japanese victory with virtually no long-term strategic consequences. So now we're going to take that same scenario and we're going to make one caveat to it, and that'll be the decision to not use Yorktown at Midway, either because it gets sunk or because the damage is just so bad that Nimitz looks at it and says, okay, this isn't going to happen. So if we pick up, the battle remains unchanged. The main distinction is, if the Yorktown is sunk, it crystallizes the Japanese understanding, and they realize immediately, with both ships sunk, that they have air superiority, right? And they're more likely to proceed with Port Moresby. If it departs and it's simply not available because the Nimitz decides, it's not ready to go, that'll have consequences at Midway, but it really won't affect the battle here in the Coral Sea. So pretty much no difference between scenario one here. Um, Even if we let the Yorktown live, we still have the same basic results. The Japanese reconstitute themselves and move on and take Port Moresby, and more or less identical to scenario one, and more or less identical results. The only difference here might be if the Yorktown was definitively sunk. Of course, that will make the victory even more impressive. But the key takeaway, and probably the difference in both of these scenarios between what the History Undone guys did and what I'm suggesting, is we didn't have to restructure this battle in such a way that both Yukaku and Shikaku survived and might be available for a 6-on-2 fight at the Battle of Midway. This takes the battle as it was and gives the Japanese a major victory. And in scenario one, there's really no long-term consequence. But here we start to see some real long-term consequences. Scenario two, where Yorktown is not available for one reason or another, and Nimitz has to go on and fight without Yorktown at Midway. Now, at this point, we're going to obviously have to speculate about how this battle would have gone if they even fought it. Okay, so I'm going to pretend that they're going to go ahead and take their 2 aircraft carriers against the 4 because they feel Midway represents a 3rd carrier and they have surprise and all that sort of stuff. And so they're going to go ahead and take the gamble. And again, whether Yorktown is sunk or simply unavailable is kind of irrelevant, as long as it's just going to be the Hornet and the Enterprise. Now, any countless thousands of millions of alternatives could have occurred, but let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that the Enterprise and the Hornet perform more or less exactly the same way that they did in the real fight. This is important, because remember, Hornet, you really have a scenario now that it's one and a third carriers, or 1.5 carriers from the Americans against 4 carriers for the Japanese. And why do I say 1.5? I mean, the Hornet's a fully equipped aircraft carrier. But if you remember what happens at the Battle of Midway, basically the fighters and the dive bombers from Hornet go on the flight to nowhere. Nobody knows why they went off to the west, but they just disappeared and provided no meaningful contribution. So the way the battle unfolded was you had, in the reality, was you had the um, fighters, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers of Yorktown and Enterprise, and the torpedo planes from Hornet that make the attack on a Keto Butai. Okay, so Yorktown's not here. So what does that mean? Basically, the scenario is you have the Enterprise, her fighters, her dive bombers, and her torpedo bombers, and the Torpedo 8 Squadron from the Hornet attacking those four ships, those four carriers. And we're not going to change, for this purpose, we're not going to change to, and make Lieutenant Dick Best sink three carriers in one day. McCluskey is going to take his guys to the south. They're going to find that destroyer that's dealing with the Nautilus. They're going to point their way back to the fleet, and they're going to arrive over the top of four carriers, and they're going to attack the Kagi and the Akaga just like they did in the real world. The difference now is that there are no Yorktown dive bombers coming from the other direction to take on the Soryu. So at the end of the day, or at the end of the first wave of engagements here, what you have is Soryu and Hiryu are more or less fully intact, and of course now you only have two aircraft carriers, and so on the American side, so now it's a 2-on-2 fight. Okay, so what happens there? Remember, in the real battle, the Japanese sunk the Yorktown. Well, the Yorktown isn't there. Well, how did they find the Yorktown? They found the Yorktown by more or less by following the vector that her airplanes had headed off, and they went back down the azimuth and found the Yorktown, and they attacked it. And the Yorktown was operating separate from the Enterprise and the Hornet. So the bulk of Hiryu's fighters found a single carrier and attacked that single carrier, and they thought they sunk it, but they didn't. So now let's apply that to this scenario where we have this Hiryu and the Soryu both surviving, and they're going to pretty much do the same thing, right? They're going to follow, in this case, the Enterprise aircraft back, and the Enterprise and the Hornet are working together. So that means that when Soryu and Hiryu's attack planes arrive and detect an aircraft carrier, they're going to actually detect both of those carriers at the same time. Now, whether or not they sink none or one or both of the American carriers, it's, let's assume for the sake of discussion that the augmented Japanese force can take out at least one of those carriers, right? Worst case, they almost took out a weakened strike, almost took out the Yorktown. So a full force strike could probably take out one of the two carriers that they found, and maybe a second. So here you have at the end of the retaliation that Japan has two operational carriers, and Spruance has, if he's lucky, he has one. And that carrier might even be damaged. That assumes he has anything. But we're going to look at the historical record and say, what would Spruance have done? And we know that in the night, as the night approached in the course of the real events, even though he knew he had sunk four carriers, he still withdrew his fleet so that he couldn't be caught up in a general engagement with with Yamamoto's force coming up behind. So Admiral Spruance, in light of four sunk carriers and one damaged American carrier, was careful enough to withdraw and not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And so, why would he not withdraw with his one carrier in the face of two carriers? It just wouldn't make any sense. So, the assumption here at the end of the day is that once the Japanese degrade the American carrier force, um, even if he somehow managed to get both those carriers out of there alive, um, we're going to assume that he's smart enough to follow his own good advice and withdraw from the night fight to the east. And then the question becomes, what happens next? So in my scenario, I'm assuming that at least one of the carriers was sunk and the other was damaged, and its Bruins has is going to withdraw. Obviously you don't know for sure, but this would be the sensible thing to do at this point. Yamamoto's bringing up his battleships. You have two fleet carriers available. I believe that with what they were bringing to the fight, Midway was still it was still achievable, right? They could still capture it. Could there have been a Wake Island scenario? Maybe, but we're going to go ahead and, for the sake of discussion, give the Japanese this victory. They're going to capture this thing and consolidate it. And now you're sitting in a situation where we had two consecutive major victories. So really three, if you think about the Pearl Harbor attack, the Coral Sea attack, and the Midway in this scenario. Um, this would have been utterly devastating. And interspersed in those three battles were things like the sinking of the Prince of Wales and Repulse, the British, the taking of Singapore, the conquering of the Philippines, Malaysia, everything they touched, right? So at this point in the game, what does this mean for the war? If you lose both of those battles, I think you're saying, all right, we don't have the carrier assets to fight this war right now, and so we're going to have to be on a defensive posture. And if we're lucky, we will be able to hold Hawaii. I think that Hawaii is a bridge too far for the Japanese, given the concentration of American forces. It's Look how long it took them to take the Philippines. Granted, the Philippines is bigger, but the quality and quantity of the forces available in Hawaii was better. Um, I just I think they were at their wits' end by this time. And remember, in our scenario, they've lost two of their six main carriers in the Battle of Midway, uh, the Akagi and the Kaga. So I think they take Midway, but I don't, and they don't take Hawaii. So that gives them Midway, New Guinea, the Solomons, Port Moresby. Their perimeter is now very well set, and the Americans simply don't have the physical resources at this point to go on the offensive. So I think what you see is a shift at this point to an America, or to Germany first, and then at some point in the future, either after the European War is concluded, or like 40, late 43, 44, you begin your campaign once some of those Essex carriers are coming online. But even in this scenario, even where they win Coral Sea and they win Port Moresby and they effectively eliminate the carrier force in the Battle of Midway with relatively minimal losses, let's say two fleet carriers, there's no way that they survive, because eventually, on the assumption that Germany is defeated, eventually the Soviets intervene. Of course, we don't know about the atomic bomb in 1942, but if we don't change history as much as possible, the progression of the European War really didn't have much, wasn't influenced dramatically by the Pacific War in the first place. So the presumption is that Germany, would have been defeated, that the Soviet Union would have eventually come in. They did come into the war in August of 45 in an effort. So there's all likelihood they would have come into the war. The atomic bomb wasn't affected by the Battle of the Pacific, so it would have progressed. And if the other elements of history remained true to form, um, the economic production, the Soviets, and the atomic bomb would have eventually brought the war to an end. Okay, so how'd we do? We start off with the battle. The changes we made in this discussion were basically in the minds of Fletcher, the Japanese commander, and Nimitz, right? Fletcher makes a decision to move immediately. The Japanese commander looks at the situation, is patient enough to do the reconnaissance and come to his own conclusion that it is safe to proceed. And then Nimitz, at least in scenario two, Nimitz is forced to proceed to Midway with no Yorktown. Those are the three like human decisions that are made in all of these scenarios. The Yorktown potentially survives. It potentially goes back to Pearl Harbor. It's potentially available for later use. Um, maybe it gets sunk, maybe it doesn't down in Coral Sea, but we really didn't have to make very many changes to the situation for the Battle of Coral Sea to have resulted in a major victory of taking Port Moresby on the part of the Japanese. And with one or two minor uh, changes to history, the Battle of Midway could have gone dramatically different, or it might have gone exactly as it did. And so in scenario one, there's very, very little impact to the long term course of the war in the Pacific. In scenario two, where Yorktown is not available for Midway, it could have dramatic effects, and that's where I think Coral Sea is underestimated by a sliver. The Everyone focuses on Midway, but by a sliver, the Midway battle can't happen the way it did for lack of physical resources, and the war could have been very, very different. But in the end, um, barring some dramatic change of historical sentiment on the part of the Americans, which I don't foresee. I mean, to his dying day, my step granddad, he would not buy a Japanese car. He hated Hirohito, right? I mean, 50 years later, he hated the guy. He was driving around in a Ford Escort piece of junk. This is not the modern Ford Escort, the 1970s Ford Escort. It was a piece of junk, and he would not buy a Toyota Corolla. Um, that was how visceral the American attitude was toward the Japanese. And so I don't see the Japanese winning the war in any circumstance, um, on the simple provision that America doesn't quit. Okay, put your comments in the bottom. Let me know what you think. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you in the next one.